Okay, we're going to take a look at the systemic and pulmonary circuits of blood. But before I start to do that, let's just talk a little bit about how blood flows from one blood vessel to another. The heart is the pump, so the heart imparts kinetic energy to blood, so it will flow through miles and miles of blood vessels. The heart pumps blood out into arteries, and arteries eventually enter into organs and branch into smaller and smaller arteries, eventually giving rise to arterioles. So arteries and arterioles carry blood away from the heart and into capillary networks. From capillaries, the blood drains into venules. Venules merge into veins, and veins merge into each other. The veins get larger and larger. Eventually a vein leaves an organ and drains into larger and larger veins that carry blood back to the heart. So a circuit, when I talk about a circuit of blood, is a network of blood vessels, and there's two circuits of blood vessels within the body, each consisting of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. One is called the systemic circuit. The other is the pulmonary circuit. And we're going to look at both the systemic and pulmonary circuits. So we'll begin by looking at the systemic circuit. It's a system of blood vessels that begins with the aorta and ends with the vena cava. There's two vena cava. There's a superior vena cava and an inferior vena cava. And the vena cava empty into the right atrium of the heart. The systemic pump is the left ventricle, which I'll abbreviate LV, and the left ventricle pumps blood out into the aorta, which begins the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit carries oxygen and nutrients to the cells of the body and carries away the carbon dioxide that cells make during cellular respiration. The pulmonary circuit is another circuit of blood vessels that goes only to the lungs. It's exclusive to the lungs. So the pulmonary circuit begins with the pulmonary trunk and ends with the pulmonary veins that empty into the left atrium of the heart. The pulmonary pump is the right ventricle, which I'll abbreviate RV, and the pulmonary pump is going to pump blood into the pulmonary circuit that carries its blood to the pulmonary capillaries that cover the air sacs within the lungs. So the air sacs are also called alveoli. So alveoli and air sacs mean the same thing. Gas exchange occurs as blood goes through the pulmonary capillaries, where the blood picks up oxygen and gets rid of its CO2. I'll be using the term exchange. And exchange is a term that means that two things are moving in opposite direction. So if I bought a shirt from a retail store, brought it home and found it had a hole in it and it was defective, I'd bring it back and do an exchange. I would give them my defective shirt and they would either replace it or give me my money back. So my shirt is moving in one direction and the exchange item, my money or a replacement shirt, would be moving in the other direction. So when two variables are moving in opposite directions, that's called an exchange. Whenever I talk about gas exchange, I'm always going to be talking about oxygen and CO2, and they're always going to be moving in opposite directions. So just a little bit about heart chambers and major blood vessels associated with the heart. The heart is four-chambered. There's two upper chambers called atria The singular form of atria is atrium. And then two lower chambers called ventricles. The atria, or the upper chambers, receive blood that's returning to the heart from veins. There's an atrium on the right side and one on the left side. The one on the right side is the right atrium, and I'll abbreviate that RA. And the right atrium receives venous return from the superior and inferior vena cava coming in from the systemic circuit. And the left atrium on the left side receives venous return from the pulmonary veins associated with the pulmonary circuit. So on the side of each of the atria is an expandable pouch known as an auricle. The atria are separated from one another by a wall of cardiac muscle called the interatrial septum. The lower chambers are the ventricles, and there's one on the right side and one on the left. The right ventricle, which I'll abbreviate RV, is the pulmonary pump in that it pumps blood into the pulmonary circuit. And the left ventricle, which I'll abbreviate LV, is the systemic pump in that it pumps blood by way of the aorta into the systemic circuit. So there's a ball of cardiac muscle between the ventricles, and it's known as the interventricular septum. So before I go on, I just want to review a biochemical process that occurs within cells called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the way in which the cells of the body make an energy-rich compound called adenosine triphosphate. Of course, we just call it ATP. Cells must make ATP or they die, because ATP is critical, absolutely essential. It's a participant, in other words, in what are known as ATP-dependent reactions. An ATP-dependent reaction must have ATP as one of the reactants, one of the participants in the reaction. And ATP-dependent reactions include the contraction of all three types of muscle, the generation of nerve impulses, which are essentially for brain neurons to communicate with one another and send impulses out to contract skeletal muscle, exocytosis, the formation of urine. All of these processes and many others are associated with ATP-dependent reactions. So cells must make ATP to support these critical ATP-dependent reactions, or cells die. So this is an overall summary of the reactions that occur during cellular respiration. And cellular respiration as a process begins with the reactants, and they would be a reaction between an organic compound and oxygen gas. So examples of organic compounds that can be reacted with oxygen gas include glucose, also known as blood sugar, fatty acids, amino acids. There's a few other organic compounds that can participate in cellular respiration. So an organic compound like glucose reacts with oxygen and generates carbon dioxide and water as the products of this reaction. The oxygen that reacts with organic compounds comes in with the air we inhale into the lungs. The lungs deliver the oxygen to the blood. The blood carries oxygen to the cells of the body. Within cells, oxygen goes into the mitochondria and participates in the mitochondrial phase of cellular respiration. So these are the products, carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is a gaseous waste product of cellular respiration. If carbon dioxide builds up in the body, it's fatal. So the body has to get rid of the carbon dioxide that's generated during cellular respiration. And it does. The CO2 that's formed as a product of cellular respiration inside cells diffuses out of the cells into the blood, from there to the lungs, where we exhale the CO2 out of the body into the atmosphere. Now, cellular respiration makes lots of ATP, and ATP is an energy-rich compound that cells must have to support ATP-dependent reactions that are essential to the life of a cell. So this is kind of a busy illustration, but it does show the two circuits of blood, the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. So let me tell you a little bit about the blue and red color scheme that's used for coloring blood vessels on models. And by the way, blood is always red. So blood isn't going to be blue in color as it circulates within the body. This is just a convention that's used for coloring blood vessels on models. But the color of the blood vessels on the models reflects the amount of oxygen within the blood vessel. That's the percent saturation of the blood with oxygen. If a blood vessel is red, then it's 100% saturated with oxygen, and that means that it has a very high oxygen content. If the color of a blood vessel is blue, it has a lower amount of oxygen in it, and it would be colored blue as a result. Now we're going to find that the oxygen and CO2 levels are reciprocally or inversely related. If oxygen is high, CO2 will be low. On the other hand, if oxygen is low, CO2 will be high. They're always going to be opposite of one another in concentration within the blood. So, if a blood vessel is colored red, it's going to be high in oxygen and low in CO2. If a blood vessel is colored blue, it's going to be low in oxygen and high in CO2. So you have to begin somewhere when you talk about these two circuits of blood, and I'll begin in the left ventricle of the heart. And the left ventricle of the heart is the systemic pump that pumps blood into the aorta and then through the rest of the systemic circuit. So the left ventricle, or the systemic pump, pumps its blood into the aorta, which arches over the heart. There's major arteries off the aorta, and we'll follow one of these arteries into the upper extremity. So let's just assume that this artery enters into a skeletal muscle. Maybe it's the deltoid muscle or the bicep or the tricep. And a systemic artery, as it enters into an organ of the body, is going to branch repeatedly into smaller and smaller arteries that eventually lead to arterioles. So this would be a systemic arteriole, colored red, because the blood it carries is high in oxygen, low in CO2, and the blood in the systemic arteriole enters a systemic capillary. Now, within capillaries, whether we're talking about systemic capillaries or pulmonary capillaries, that's where gas exchange occurs, where oxygen moves in one direction and CO2 in the other. The gas exchange that occurs in the systemic capillaries has oxygen leaving the blood and going into cells within an organ of the body, and the carbon dioxide that cells make as a result of cellular respiration leaves the cells by diffusion and goes into the systemic capillaries. So the blood draining out of the systemic capillaries drains into systemic venules. They'd be colored blue, because as blood goes through the systemic capillaries, it loses oxygen that cells use to make ATP and gains CO2. So systemic venule is colored blue because its oxygen content is relatively low and CO2 levels are high. When the oxygen level of blood is low and CO2 levels are high, we need to get that blood to the lungs so we can pick up oxygen and get rid of that CO2. So the systemic venules eventually drain into systemic veins that empty out of organs of the body. And the systemic veins from organs above the diaphragm eventually empty their blood into the superior vena cava, whereas organs below the diaphragm would eventually empty their blood into the inferior vena cava. So the vena cava empty their blood into the right atrium of the heart, and this is blood that would be low in oxygen and high in CO2, blood that we need to pump to the lungs to pick up oxygen and get rid of that CO2. And the blood in the right atrium goes through a hole into the right ventricle, which is your pulmonary pump. And the right ventricle is going to pump its blood into an artery called the pulmonary trunk artery. Now, people don't generally say pulmonary trunk artery. Instead, they just call it the pulmonary trunk. But it's an artery because it's carrying blood away from the heart towards capillaries. So the pulmonary trunk artery is carrying blood coming out of the right ventricle that's low in oxygen and high in CO2. As a result, it's an artery that's colored blue. We're going to find that the coloring convention is just the opposite between the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. In the systemic circuit, the arteries are colored red and the veins are colored blue, whereas in the pulmonary circuit, the arteries are colored blue and the veins are colored red. So the blue colored artery, known as the pulmonary trunk, coming out of the right ventricle, branches, and we're going to take the left pulmonary artery into the left lung. So within the left lung, the left pulmonary artery branches repeatedly into smaller and smaller arteries that eventually lead to pulmonary arterioles. Pulmonary arterioles are colored blue because they're carrying blood that is low in oxygen and high in CO2. It's this blood then that goes through the pulmonary capillaries where gas exchange occurs. Gas exchange only occurs across the walls of capillaries, and the level of gases within the blood only changes as blood goes through either the systemic capillaries where gas exchange occurs or the pulmonary capillaries where gas exchange occurs. As the blood goes through the pulmonary capillaries, it's going to lose its carbon dioxide, which would be exhaled, and gain oxygen. So this is the exchange of gases, and this would be blood after gas exchange that travels into the pulmonary venules. Now within the pulmonary venules, the blood has gained oxygen, so it's high in oxygen, lost CO2, so it's low in CO2. And this means that the pulmonary venules would be colored red. The blood in the pulmonary venules joins other venules to become veins, and ultimately the blood drains out of each lung by way of 2 pulmonary veins for each lung. And in this case, this would be the 2 left pulmonary veins, colored red, because they're carrying blood that's high in oxygen and low in CO2. And this is blood that comes into the left atrium of the heart. From the left atrium of the heart, blood goes into the left ventricle, and we begin again. So there are 2 completely separate circuits of blood there's the systemic circuit that consists of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And then you've got a pulmonary circuit that consists of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. So just a little bit about the structure of the heart valves. These are structures associated with the heart that regulate unidirectional or one-way flow. The blood comes into the heart, goes from the atria, then to the ventricles, and the ventricles pump the blood out into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So this flow of blood through the heart is regulated by what are called the heart valves. And they're unidirectional valves. So we've got the AV valves and the semilunar valves, and we'll look at the AV valves first. So there are one-way valves between the atria and the ventricles, known as atrioventricular valves. They're also called AV valves for short. And there's two of these. One of them is the tricuspid valve. It's the right AV valve, and it consists of three flaps, where a flap is called a cusp. So the tricuspid valve has three cusps, or three flaps that make it up. And then we've got the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, because it's made up of two cusps, or two flaps. And the mitral valve is also known as the left AV valve, whereas the tricuspid valve would be known as the right AV valve. The edges of the flaps, or the cusps, are attached by little strings called chordae tendineae to columns of cardiac muscle coming off the ventricular wall called the papillary muscles. The function of the AV valves is to prevent blood in the ventricles from going back into the atria. The semilunar valves are found between the ventricles and the arterial outlets. So the right ventricle pumps its blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle pumps its blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. The semilunar valves prevent blood in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk from going back into the ventricles. The pulmonary semilunar valve is found at the base of the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic semilunar valve is found at the base of the aorta. So here is an illustration showing the heart chambers and these one-way valves. So these would be the vena cava, delivering blood into the right atrium. And the blood in the right atrium goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And then when the right ventricle contracts, it's going to pump blood out of the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve that's at the base of the pulmonary trunk. And the blood pumped by the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve would go into the pulmonary trunk and then through the rest of the pulmonary circuit. Over here is the left atrium, and the blood in the left atrium coming in from the pulmonary veins goes through the mitral valve, also called the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, blood is pumped out through the aortic semilunar valve at the base of the aorta, and the blood in the aorta then is distributed into the systemic circuit. The reason I've drawn dashed lines here is the aorta actually goes through the middle of the heart, so you can't see it from the outside of the heart. We don't see it until it emerges from the top of the heart and then arches over with arteries branching off it. Now, over here with the tricuspid valve, I've drawn just 2 flaps, but there's actually 3 flaps. So I've only drawn 2 of the 3 flaps, but the tricuspid valve consists of 3 flaps, and the bicuspid valve consists of 2 flaps, and I've drawn both of those. The edges of the flaps are attached to columns of cardiac muscle known as papillary muscles by way of fibrous connective tissue strings called the chordae tendineae. So the edges of the flaps by way of the chordae tendineae are attached to the tops of the papillary muscles. And the papillary muscles are columns of cardiac muscle coming off the ventricular walls. Again, the right ventricle is the pulmonary pump, pumping blood into the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary semilunar valve, and the left ventricle is the systemic pump, pumping blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta.